A couple of weeks ago, I made note that we were transitioning our gospel readings from the resurrection to pre-resurrection stories, even as we continue to celebrate Easter for several more weeks. While some of these stories are from earlier in the ministry of Jesus, today's gospel is part of a multi-chapter long dissertation that John's Jesus gives between the Last Supper and the arrest. There is not much said after the resurrection by Jesus, so this really is the final instruction of Jesus to his disciples about what it means to follow him. And today's section is particularly meaningful this week because Thursday will mark 40 days after Easter Sunday, which means that Thursday is the Feast of the Ascension. It is the day that Christians mark to remember the day on which Jesus ascended into heaven and left the disciples to their own devices until Pentecost, 10 days later. The promise of today's gospel, and I will ask the Father, and he will give you another advocate to be with you forever. This is the Spirit of truth, whom the world cannot give, because it neither sees him nor knows him. You know him because he abides with you, and he will be in you. I will not leave you orphaned, is therefore understood in this context. We are marking a time when it seemed as though God had gone out of the world, and his followers had been abandoned. The speech by Jesus was meant to keep hope alive and believe in that in some way that they would continue to feel his presence in their lives and that an advocate was coming. But that this advocate would come in a form that those who lived in the way of Christ would be able to see and know, but the world would not be able to see or know. And Jesus also made it clear that discipleship is not simply a statement of faith, the lived experience of that faith. That is, it is not simply enough to say, I love Jesus, I am a Christian, but rather it is more important to keep the commandments. Now, in this context, when we are talking about the commandments of Jesus, we are not talking about the 10 Commandments. The 10 Commandments provide a list of things to do and not do in order to demonstrate love of God and love of neighbor. I am the Lord your God. You shall have no other gods but me. You shall not make for yourself an idol. You shall not dishonor the name of the Lord your God. Remember the Sabbath and keep it holy. Honor your mother and your father. You shall not commit murder. You shall not commit adultery. You shall not steal. You shall not be a false witness. You shall not covet anything that belongs to your neighbor. It is a good list. And it draws attention to some of the ways we cause harm to one another and to our relationship with God through our actions. But it also leaves a lot of those ways out. The authors of the Old Testament books recognize this shortcoming, and hundreds of other prescriptive regulations are included in the Torah. But still, at the time of Jesus, the Pharisees still saw people following the letter of the law, but not the spirit of the law. So they further expanded on these hundreds of prescriptive regulations. But each time fences were being drawn further out to try to encourage righteous behavior, there were always those who were looking for loopholes rather than trying to live in accord with one another and with God. In John, Jesus does not even give his disciples the Beatitudes. He simply says, love one another as I have loved you. We are called to live by the 10 Commandments, but they are there as guide rails, not as the direction for our lives. If you are constantly hitting up against bearing false witness or committing adultery or constructing idols, then like when you are wobbling between the yellow and white lines on the road, maybe it is time to take a break and get yourself back together. Most of the time, we should not be concentrating on not hitting the guide rails, but rather on the directions, on loving one another. And so whether we feel God alive in our lives or distant, that is our calling, to follow our call to love. Amen.